Well, good evening and welcome to Unfiltered on SABC 3 and SABC Channel 404, SABC News Channel 404. The ANC, Africa's oldest liberation movement, just turned 108 last week, and the party used the January 8th statement to set the tone for its programs for the rest of the year. Party President Cyril Ramaphosa said the organization would be guided by the Freedom Charter, which was drafted 65 years ago. Was this just another event where the old age organization set itself some lofty and unachievable goals? Has the party become yet another political organization which is failing to live up to the hopes and dreams of its followers and members, much like Zimbabwe's ZANU-PF, Frelimo, UNITA, SWAPO in Namibia? Today, ordinary South Africans are suffering from disillusionment amid high levels of unemployment, poverty, failing parastatals, most notably the South African Airways, Eskom and Transnet. On the back of the ANC celebrating its 108th year of existence, we're asking tonight, does the ANC still resonate with the needs of and the aspirations of pre-democracy South Africa? Tonight we're joined by Pule Mabi. He's the ANC national spokesperson. We're also joined by Professor Susan Boyson. She's a visiting professor at Wits University and director of research at Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA. Professor William Gumede is chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation. We also welcome on the line, we are joined by Dr. Siphamandla Zondi. He's a political science professor at the University of Pretoria. A very warm welcome to all of you. Good evening. Perhaps it only makes sense to start with you, Mr. Mabi. And although it's last week's news, but it sort of set the tone for ANC 108. The Sowetan Sunday World editorial saying Deputy President David Mabuza was correct to speak frankly and precipitate the overdue departure of the other Mabuza. We note that leadership is now coming from the Deputy President, Mr. President. Is that the case?
Well, evening, Desiree, and evening to the core guests here. Well, the president of the African National Congress, President Cyril Ramaphosa, is the president of the organization and continues to provide the required leadership. As a matter of fact, the president himself, through his office, had issued a statement welcoming the resignation of Jabu Mabuza as chairman of the board of Eskom, having cited the reasons that are now known out in the public. The ANC itself, as an organization that the president leads, also followed up with a statement in that regard. So it is important that we all understand that the entirety of the executive that is led by President Ramaphosa is at one on all of these issues. There is no disjuncture in terms of how things should be done. We have got a working National Executive Committee of the African National Congress that meet at all material times. Actually, in the build-up to the January 8th statement being read out by the president of the ANC, there was a special NEC that would have expressed itself, including on what it expects to see being the role of SOEs. We even concluded that meeting, even agreed that there must be a special NEC that focuses itself on the work of SOEs. So I think it would be unfair to draw an inference that suggests that leadership is now coming from number two. As a matter of fact, the national executive of the Republic of South Africa seems to be at one in terms of making sure that the efficiency levels, the right skill set are brought up to be able to drive forward a trajectory of development in these SOEs.
But what would have taken so long to employ these right skill set? There might be statements that are being sent out and all these efforts to reach out to the public, but let me go back to this thing. It says, and precipitated the overdue departure. There's a concern in the country that the president is indecisive. Was there a need for the deputy president to then step in and take decisive action?
Well, the president himself has always raised concerns about the role of SOEs. You know, in fact, and to be fair to the president, he always takes the National Executive Committee, including the National Working Committee of the ANC, on board in terms of the interventions that are being employed to turn around the situation on the SOEs. So it was the case even on the SAA with the deployment of the business rescue practitioners and all of that, including having to make sure that all of us appreciate the challenges that come with the work that needs to be done. So that ultimately, when the final decisions are implemented or are executed out there in the public, the organization that he himself lead is taken on board. I can tell you, I mean, the president made himself available over this weekend to talk to the SABC on a one-on-one basis and had a very frank talk with them. So if the president was not that available, he wouldn't have created that space. But not only that, almost every Monday, the president of the African National Congress, in his capacity as president of the Republic of South Africa, issues out a letter out to the public where he begins to reflect on the sort of interventions that are there. Of course, we need to also acknowledge where there are challenges. We cannot sit here, we can't sit here and just
Now, can I ask you something?
Yes.
The 108 celebrations come against the backdrop of stories that the ANC is struggling financially, it's not paying salaries to its employees, and there is sentiment that the organization needs to relook how it celebrates January 8th. Instead of going all out and having parties and requiring to go to stadiums that they evidently now can't fill. Is there a conversation within the African National Congress about different ways of celebrating January 8th? But also, again, against this backdrop of a ballooning complement of stuff at Luthuli House, you have Khalni House going on Twitter and almost taking a contrary route to what the African National Congress, that you have a national spokesperson, but he has given himself that position to speak out for the African National Congress. How do you discipline a person like Khalni House?
Well, thanks, Desiree, and thanks for bringing up those issues honestly in that way. But maybe to just clarify one point for the sake of your viewers, the ANC does not have a financial crisis. The only unfortunate part was that the 25th of December set on a day that was going to be a public holiday in any event. And communications was made to staff at Luthuli House.
So there's no 2 months backlog?
No, there's no 2 months backlog. I mean, including Khalni House, he's not authorized to speak on behalf of the ANC. He's expressing his own views, and I'm sure that the ANC...
He's your staff member.
Of course, the ANC will have to look at what policies say as it relates to staff members who go and speak out of 10 without being mandated by anyone. I can tell you now, he is not delegated to speak on behalf of the movement. The views that he's expressing are his own personal views. They have got nothing to do with the ANC. And we must also stress this point. No one employed at the ANC represent a faction. All of us who work at Luthuli House and those that were elected at the 54th National Conference have got a duty to hold on to the unity of the African National Congress. And the leadership of the ANC is not going to hesitate to act against those of its staff members that are peddling divisions well within its own ranks, including those that might be using social media to undermine what the ANC is doing. If there are challenges, and if comrades feel that they need to deposit issues, they must use internal platforms well within the African National Congress to be able to express themselves. They mustn't go out and create an impression that there's a crisis when none exists. Of course, as it relates to mobilization and how we approach events like January 8th, we've got the organizing a unit of the African National Congress that is led by Comrade Senzo Mkhunu, that also include Mam Nomvola Mukonyani, and a bigger team, Comrade Dakota Lehuete. It is their duty to then say to the ANC, going forward, let's consider these forms of organizing our structures and all of that. But we also appreciate the vastness of a province like the Northern Cape. The Northern Cape is not like Gauteng, which is vastly populated, but the province is, I mean, you can basically travel around Gauteng.
I don't think you can compare, though, because when you've had such meetings in Gauteng, you'd have people coming in from different provinces as well.
Well, I agree with that, but I'm just saying, look, I'm not taking anything away from the issues that you are raising.
Okay.
And I think...
I'm going to ask you to hold on to your thoughts. I'm told I need to take a break, and when we return, we also engage our other guest. You're watching Unfiltered. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're having a conversation about African liberation movements, are they failing to govern? That's our discussion tonight here on Unfiltered as a result of celebrations over the weekend. The African National Congress, the oldest liberation movement on the continent, celebrating 108 years of existence and 25 years of being in government. And let me bring in my guests. Professor Gumede, I'll start with the same question that I asked Mr. Pule, but just touch on an article you wrote yesterday saying there's an opportunity in this energy crisis, and you're suggesting a parallel reform strategy. That's not a new conversation, is it? That's why there's always been engagement with independent power producers, and this conversation doesn't seem to be progressing to an end where we can have a solution.
You know, the reason why I made that argument of, I mean, you would wonder, why would anyone make an argument for a parallel process to the current process? So the reason why I'm making that argument is essentially that the ANC is so contested now. There's so many factions in it. There's no unity, and there's not going to be realistically any unity for the next 5 years. And because there's no unity, and there's not going to be any unity if we're realistic, if we're objective, if we're neutral, for the next 5 years, then we have to say we're sitting with Eskom, and Eskom is our biggest problem. It provides 90% of our energy, and it is, you know, the unemployment, the growth, and so on, because of the power outages and the crisis, and it will take us down, because in many other African countries after the Second World War, it's often the state-owned entities in the crisis, debts in the crisis, that brings the countries down, and the World Bank comes in, IMF comes in. So we are on that trajectory, and we are on that trajectory because there's no one view in the ANC. Of course, you know, party leaders, of course, they have to say there's one view.
And you also add on to that justification by saying that Eskom has put out its strategy for the next 5 years, and parallelly at the same time the department of Mr. Pravin Gordhan's department also puts out its own energy strategy. That can be confusing.
You know, so my argument is for a way out of the crisis, to say then the first thing we must accept that there is a crisis in the ANC and that a crisis impact on SOEs, that the crisis in the ANC is not going to be resolved over the next 3 or 5 years. So if one comes to that, they want to say, okay, what else do we do? Because one has to be realistic. Then the realistic thing then to do is to say, in the case of Eskom, maybe because there's going to be such a contest for such a long while, because there's political different views of what to do with Eskom within the ANC, that's not going to be resolved unless we're going to have really political courage, you know, from the president and the top leaders of the ANC to drive through the myths and through the confusion and through the different factions to give one line. So, and because there's not going to be one line, we could say, maybe what would be an alternative? I think an alternative would be, while the ANC still battles with Eskom on the one hand, we could in the meantime say, can we provide alternative energy sources as quickly as possible? Can we get renewable energy? Can we get gas? Can we get communities to generate their own things? I
particularly like the one about suggesting that municipalities have the means to provide their own energy, and they should be given the opportunity to do so. Professor Boyson, let's bring you into the conversation here. We're sitting with Pule Mabi, and he says there are no factions within the African National Congress. Is it then a matter of ineptness, no leadership?
Well, if there are no factions in the ANC, that's a development of the last few minutes. So far, there have been factions, as William rightly says, too. And certainly there are ways in which, occasions on which, NEC meetings at which there is consensus, and there's one, and there could be often one position that emerges. There often is not. We know very well that the President Cyril Ramaphosa, often has to look at, okay, what statement now has come out of Luthuli House? And it could be something that was not in line even with what an NEC just resolved. We had one such instance last year. And Cyril Ramaphosa is being challenged on and on continuously, where he has to pull it together, because the ANC depends on not splitting again. If it had been 2007, 2008, the ANC would have split again. Those kind of divisions that existed in the ANC. You reckon
they can't afford that now?
If the ANC splits again to that extent that it split at a time when the Cope people left the ANC, and a new political party gets 7-8% of the vote, the ANC will be at 50%, if not less than that, if it is a stronger case that's made this time around.
Yep.
And the ANC has delivered evidence time and time again in government. And the ANC, it's no coincidence that ANC's power is quite enduring. It's a systematic process. There are campaigns, not just for unity, but there are historic narratives that are nurtured, and people are persuaded that there is reason still to have hope in ANC. There's a whole hope
The very hope that they're calling
manufacturing
for.
industry
Yes.
in the ANC. And so the ANC is working very, very hard to project that image and to keep itself together, because at this stage it hasn't got an option but to do it. But the fact that they are staying together does not mean there is unity of voices. One can just listen to the Cyril Ramaphosa 108 address delivered, of course, on behalf of the NEC and collectively written, but it is. So there are so many answers, efforts in there to answer the accusations being levelled against him that the resolutions of Nazareth 2017 are not being implemented. We see those are being pinpointed throughout. Yes, we're doing that. Yes, we're doing that.
Professor Zondi, let's bring you into the conversation here. Is the ANC in crisis?
The ANC itself says that it faces many crises. As way back as 1999, it was already recognizing that it faces crises that relate to managing its own transition from fighting against apartheid to now governing democracy. It talks about factionalism, it talks about leadership weaknesses, decision weaknesses. It itself, in a number of organizational reports in every one of the last 5 conferences, it points to those. But it doesn't always want to declare that in public. But when it talks to itself, it recognizes that it has this challenge. The number of these changes in leadership were also in response to deep crisis internally and trying to manage it. And I think it has been successful. I mean, it's part of all we can say about it. It has been successful to bring itself from the brink of collapse. And a number of times in the past 25 years where it was almost collapsing, 2005 and 2007, in 2012, deeply divided, and in the recent conference. It kept finding a way of redefining itself and putting itself back to the brink, but it doesn't go away from the brink. Teachers on the brink quite almost all the time, so much so that it becomes almost a permanent position of constantly trying to renew and survive, constantly trying to regain ascendance, constantly trying to redefine who it is and project itself in new ways and positive ways. And like all political parties, it has to fight for its survival, it has to sell its narrative, it has to project its image, it has to use whatever means of power it has, and this power of masses and therefore big rallies is very important for the ANC survival, and therefore it turns out that in Northern Cape the numbers were low. It can become a danger to the ANC's own strategy for survival and dominance.
Professor Spamandla Zondi there. Let's take a break. You're watching Unfiltered. Stay with us, and when we come back, we'll be taking a look at some of your thoughts on social media. Welcome back. You're watching Unfiltered. We're having a conversation about hashtag ANC108. Let's take a look at some of the thoughts you've sent through. We were asking you if the ANC is still keeping its promises. So Master Graham says, so when did the ANC uphold any of its promises? Andrew Janssen van Vieren saying they need a new mandate as it was promised during election to fix and privatize SOEs, tax revolt. Well, that's another conversation, tax revolt, that we might not have an opportunity to get into. One of the things that have come out of hashtag ANC108, Mr. Pulemabi, is something that the Citizen newspaper said, titled as "The Difficult Task for Cyril." Growing calls for Minister Pravin Gordhan to What's the conversation within the African National Congress about this?
Maybe before, let me just clarify the point we labored on about whether factions are there or not. I think the point I was making was that there is no member of staff who represent a faction in the ANC. I think that is just a matter of principle that ought to be noted. When we are there, the expectation is that we must.
We
all
hear you,
serve
and
the
it's noted, but it's difficult to separate staff from ANC members, is it? Because one can flow into the other.
No. They are members of the ANC. You
Yeah.
can't work for the ANC when you're not a member of the ANC.
Absolutely.
But when you are staff, you don't represent a faction. That's the point. Even if you are, if you do that, let it be your own.
In your
cause
official
there.
capacity.
But you can't in your
All
official
right.
capacity. No one has got that.
Is Pravin Gordhan going?
Well, the ANC has never said and discussed who is going to be a minister, who goes and who stays as a minister. That is really the prerogative of the sitting president of the republic. It is his own duty to do an assessment of people that, men and women that he has appointed in the executive.
There's definitely a sentiment within the organization.
Well, I don't know. In the National Executive Committee that I sit in, there's never been a discussion. I can't come here and manufacture a conversation that I've never been part of. I don't remember myself sitting in a conversation that suggests that if I said so, I will be lying. So I respect your viewers.
Professor Poison, it's been a long-standing conversation about an imminent cabinet reshuffle. But now that this talk, these demands, today on SABC News, we're talking to several unions and all of them are saying he's got to go. What's going to happen?
Yes, in the first place, we've become used to, under President Jacob Zuma, former President Jacob Zuma, it was ritualistic. Whenever policy or nuclear deals do not go quite the way the then president had wanted, there shall be a cabinet reshuffle, etc. And one must be very careful not to continue that tradition. It is indeed the president's prerogative to appoint that cabinet, but then he also does consult. He consults with senior ANC, with the fellow top people in the structures all the time. And it's very important, while considering what is the best deployment, who is best suited to what portfolio, not to fall into the trap of manufactured narratives as well, because there has been a lot of lobbying for Pravin Gordhan to be fired, but then that was linked to his acting against people that had inappropriate institutional behavior.
Professor Gumede, does it make a difference whether Pravin Gordhan stays or goes in comparison to other cabinet members who might not necessarily be performing so exceptionally? Is he the worst?
For me, the biggest story really is naivety. Really that political leaders within the ANC and the opposition are very naive. Now, once you've destroyed an SOE, an entity, it's not going to take you a month or 2 months to finish. Even I'm surprised that even the president would actually accept when somebody say, well, we can turn around in 12 months. It's unrealistic. It's like living in a totally different world. It takes any entity, just a basic entity, it takes you 3 to 5
And then there
years.
are conversations about sabotage as well.
Absolutely. So whoever they put there, well, if they want to push out Pravin Gordhan, whoever they put in there, it's going to be the same. It's not even going to be the same. It may be worse, because that new person now has to get acquainted with the entity, with the politics of the entity. Then some people want to move it.
Professor Zondi, the conversation about the departure of Pravin Gordhan, also there's a narrative about moving the responsibility to the Department of Energy. Will this work?
The question of political responsibility for the failures that are registered is a very important one. So that any minister who is representing government in a position of a shareholder in any state enterprise that fails, it will be wise for them to step aside if it runs into scandals, runs into deeper crises, and all of those kind of things. But in this particular case, and in the cases that we see now, the deputy president has taken a greater role by decision of cabinet in overseeing all of these things together with a team of ministers. If a minister has to go on the basis that there are failures in an institution, it might be wise that the entirety of that structure of people also take political responsibility.
Professor Zondi, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that thought. We will pick up on it again on the other side of this hour, and we say goodbye to our SABC3 viewers for now. If you'd like to continue with the conversation, join us on channel 404 on SABC News.
corruption at all levels of government will stop, and the stealing of public resources and the money that should go to serve the poor will be dealt with quite severely.
That's the President there in delivery of the January 8th statement. You're watching Unfiltered. Let's take a look at some of the social media thoughts that have come through. Harris Mabuza saying, replying to SABC News Online, and Desiree Chauke and Carl Niehaus can't keep quiet if the ANC resolutions and policies are not implemented and nothing is communicated by Bule Mabi. Another thought coming in from Facebook, Sandile Sangweni, saying not now, not ever will ANC live up to its promises, not unless their mafias and old-age liars go relax at their mentions. We'll touch on that point from the President about corruption, but let's just bring you in again, Professor Zondi, just to finish up that point you were making about political accountabilities within SOEs.
Yes, the point I was making that, if we take a matter of principle and say political responsibilities must arise in cases where there are failures in a technical agency such as ESCOM, by virtue of the fact that leaders have particular policy responsibility over what is delivered by those institutions. It then follows that once that political responsibility has been spread to a team of ministers, chaired by the deputy president, that perhaps that responsibility must be then shared by all. If there's supposed to be heads that roll, perhaps some heads must roll, but some heads must do something. But that whole group of people need to take responsibility. If you don't, you will change a minister and come to the same situation because you are avoiding dealing with dysfunctionalities in the governance system. And bank it on individual. Whether things work very well or things fail, there is a collective responsibility that must be taken for what is happening in this particular case as well.
So, Mr. Bule Mabi, when the President speaks about rooting out corruption, how does this compare to the narrative that's out there about an internal pushback? We're back to the factions, and that the people who want the President out are the people who want to perpetuate corruption.
Well, Desiree, I'm not sure if I'm not aware of people who want the President out, at least from those that are within the leadership of the ANC. All I know is that all of us are committed to the Unity and Renewal project, one which we have always pronounced on. It is important, Desiree, to appreciate that at the 54th National Conference, one of the resolutions we took was to build an ethical, developmental, and capable state. And we did speak to what would be the characteristics of such. And one of the things that we said would have to happen is dealing with instances of corruption within public sector institutions. And as a matter of course, we then went on to roll out what is now known as the Zondo Commission to try and investigate and check whether our state is captured or not. And that we have been issuing statements now from time to time, encouraging those of our comrades that would be invited to appear before the Zondo Commission to make themselves available so that they could be able to clarify on what could have been their role on issues that would arise. And we must commend those comrades who have actually heeded the call, because without them participating in the commission and being able to file their own responses, the country would not be able to know on what was the role that those individuals would have played.
The Deputy Chief Justice's request for the extension of the time frames of the commission?
Well, I take it that with proper reasons given to the powers that be, obviously when they look at those in totality, they will have to decide on what is best for the country. I'm sure whatever decision that will be made in that regard will be one that is made in the public's interest.
Why is there a delay in terms of the Lex Mbati report for the PIC Commission?
Well, again, Desiree, I'm the spokesperson of the African National Congress. They are those who are deployed in government to preside over these institutions. It is actually them who are supposed to be giving you and the viewers of the SABC proper answers to this, because in the African National Congress, we don't sit in the NEC and discuss the work that is being done by institutions of state. Because once we do that, that will be regarded by this good professor sitting here as an overreach.
When conversation says that,
all the time.
when conversation says that it's because of the tentacles of the African National Congress within this narrative that there is a delay, you don't agree with that?
Well, hence I'm saying that it is...
When we're still on the conversation of corruption.
Well, we have already pronounced ourselves on what needs to be done to deal with the cancer of corruption, and there are a number of measures. Actually, one of the priorities that we start with on our January statement, where we talk about people governing, we are talking about strengthening SOEs, making sure that we have got proper law enforcement agencies that are given the necessary resources to be able to do their work. So that where there are instances of corruption that lead to service delivery being compromised, those involved must be named and shamed, so that the ANC doesn't account and take responsibility for individuals. So individuals who are known to be doing things that undermine the delivery of basic services to people must be named and shamed.
Professor Poyson, where is the separation between the individual ANC members who have the authority to sign off multiple billion-dollar contracts, and where's the separation between them being viewed as influential ANC people or just ordinary ANC members?
It is almost impossible to draw that differentiation, just as it is almost impossible to, in many respects, to draw the differentiation between the ANC as organizational and the ANC in government power that becomes the state. And that is 25 years into democracy, a large part of the explanation for ongoing strong ANC power, because they are the patrons of the state. They are guarding and gatekeeping into vast networks. Just today we've heard about the Ministry of Public Works. So we have said Patricia de Lille, 3,700 people. She said in her own unit, I'm not quite sure whether she means her department or whatever, are doing business with the state. A few of them might have had their permissions, etc. But even when people do their declarations of potential conflict of interest, it does not mean those contracts do not get awarded. We have seen an Auditor General, provincial government, local government, that corruption is vast. And the ANC, in many respects,
not only vast, but current as well.
Current and ongoing, and no sign of it ceasing and no sign of it being controlled. As we also see in the Auditor General's reports year after year, there are a bit more teeth given to the Auditor General for his follow-up in terms of his reports now, but we are not sure that it's going to work. And just one little point there, and we know the President in his speech on behalf of the NEC had said the Integrity Committee or Commission of the ANC will
be strengthened.
He has not spelled it out. What is important is that committee or commission will no longer be subject to the ANC's NEC. That is where a big problem has been in the past.
Professor Gumede, that we were talking about your article in the Sunday newspapers. Another article in the Sunday newspapers was what the Prof just alluded to, that conversation with the Minister of Public Works, Patricia de Lille, about government employees who are doing business with government, or former employees who resigned to come back and do business with government, but also the exorbitant amounts that are being spent on state funerals.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, if ANC talks about a capable state and in a developmental state, you know, the first thing, if you know, from where I'm sitting from a research point of view, capable states since the Second World War in developing countries, the very first thing they do, zero corruption, and the way you deal with zero corruption, you start at the top. You know, you take your ANC, what the ANC should do, take the National Executive Committee, look at who is corrupt and chop them in one go, and so on. Because that's the.
But these are elected officials.
You have to do that, because that is the way normally in Singapore and in South Korea and in those countries that really, Taiwan, that's really the way that the tide against corruption have changed. You know what they did? That's exactly what they did. They took the top leaders. They didn't go there for, you know, your low-level officials and so on. They just in one go go for anybody from your deputy president or even your president down and one go chop their heads or took them to prison.
Yeah.
And that is really if we want to be serious about corruption.
Professor Zondi, your thoughts on the corruption conversation, comparatively speaking, about corruption as a historical fact and corruption as a current occurrence?
Corruption is a systemic issue because it becomes a culture in society. It's simply because it's also reinforced by the nature of the economic system that we have. By nature, the economic system that is ruling the world right now is corrupt. It enables corruption in very big ways. Simply because of that, the institutions are very important. Governance is very important. Leadership are important. People take advantage when they realize that there are no consequences for those who are flouting the rules. Well, there are rules, for example, in relation to who can do business with government and rules that preclude public officials and public servants from doing business with government. But if one gets away with it, others follow the suit. And this has been a big and perennial problem in South Africa, that if we don't fix the basics and we are not tough on the basics, you almost lose the control of the entirety of the state, especially if you allow politics and political activists and political operators to assist in diminishing the power of the state to do what it does. You will lose the state. You will never overcome the corruption issue until you fix the state, you fix government, as the National Development Plan already states in very clear ways. If we will just implement those things, we will go a long way in overcoming corruption.
All right, you're watching Unfiltered. Our guest tonight, William Mabi, he's the ANC National Spokesperson. Professor Susan Boyson, a visiting professor at Wits University and Director of Research at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. We also have Professor William Gumede, Chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation, and on the line, Professor Spamandla Zondi, Political Science Professor at the University of Pretoria. Stay with us. We'll be back for our last segment after this break.
The roots of the ANC were made up of a number of regional organizations that had been formed prior to the ANC being established. And these regional organizations spread throughout our region, including in places like Botswana, and therefore it means that the ANC has lived up, even up till today, in ensuring that consultation in everything that we do continues. So this has been a very key attribute in the life of the ANC because it was right at the foundation.
That's the African National Congress president speaking at the gala dinner before the actual celebrations. Now, the January 8th statement spelled out some priorities for the year, saying that these priorities stem from the 65-year document called the Freedom Charter. Some of those priorities include building a capable state that serves all the people of South Africa, and so on and so forth. Let's look, as we try and finalize the program, at the way forward for the African National Congress. But before we do that, Mr. Mabi, I want to ask you, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, Mr. Julius Malema, says if President Cyril Ramaphosa does not fire Pravin Gordhan, he will disrupt the State of the Nation address coming up in February. How are you responding to this?
Well, just as a matter of fact, the EFF or any other political party in this country do not dictate a program for the ANC. The ANC-led government dictate its own programs. And the ANC-led government, we develop our own manifesto, which is the basis through which we contest elections. And when we develop our own manifesto, we do not do a colloquium of political parties and agree with them on a pact that must help us govern South Africa. We have been given a mandate by over 11 million South Africans to lead this country. We have got the responsibility to lead them properly, be able to account and make sure that we can at least make sure that our ailing economy produce the much needed jobs, give youth hope. And we are not going to ask permission from other political parties that would have contested for the same power with us when we lead the people of South Africa. We have got
For
the
a
duty
very long
and the
time.
responsibility to lead, and we'll do it by ourselves. We are not in coalition at the national level. We have formed government on our own. The people of South Africa have elected us to lead them.
So for a very long time, South Africans have pinned their hopes on the ideals of the Freedom Charter.
Yes.
And there are questions at the moment asking, is it still a viable document?
Well, it is. It is. That's why where we talk about building a capable developmental state, actually, under that the subtitle is People Shall Govern. The reason why we have also introduced institutions of people's power is to make sure that we carry on with that objective and narrative that is expressed in the Freedom Charter, to make sure that we create that platform where our people could be able to govern. At the local government level, we have introduced something called IDP. It's an integrated development planning process that engages in a dialogue with people in that community, gives them an opportunity to be able to express themselves on the kind of a developmental trajectory that the municipality is supposed to carry forward. When that is done and adopted, that becomes a document, a living document that guides the work of a municipality. It is a product that came out of people themselves. When we're out in Kimberley on events leading up to the celebration itself, what we're doing was to give people a platform to express themselves with the leadership of the African National Congress, to say, here in Khalishiwe, at a certain ward, we've got a problem with the ward councillor. So that the ANC that acts decisively could be able to then say to that ward councillor, if this is not corrected, we'll have no option but to replace you. We'll have no option but to make sure that we are seen to be taking action.
There's a video that's gone viral on social media of a woman who's being asked about how she felt about the 108 celebrations, and she is very happy celebrating the African National Congress, and they ask her, what were your takeaways from the president's speech? And she says, I was sleeping at that moment.
Well, Desiree, I mean, if she has been in a bus for all those hours and felt tired along the way and slept, it's a natural thing.
Isn't that the highlight of the celebration?
Well, Comrade, Desiree, one day people are going to march to the ANC for rain. And say, this ANC need to produce rain.
You do make the promises.
But not on rain.
Professor Poison, your thoughts about the priorities of the year set out in the January 8th statement?
Yes, they speak to really important, pertinent issues that touch people's lives. And indeed, the action is necessary on those exact points. The ANC needs to persuade us, the citizens of South Africa, that it is going to deliver tangibly, maybe more tangibly than in the past, because the ANC sits with this problem that yes, there is progress and they will always be able to cite statistics, so much improvement, so much delivery, but there is a growing gap. Inequality we know is growing, and there is a big gap between what people expect and what they need, and what the ANC, and with limited state resources, fiscal problems, can deliver. And the best immediate task that the ANC can do politically is ensure that that discontent, disappointment of ordinary people continues feeding into the system, that those people continue voting and supporting the institutional aspect of procedural democracy, multi-party democracy, etc., and not full of and get into the angry protests, disruptive, destructive protests more than what has already been happening.
Professor Gumede, the Prof speaks about growing inequality, but there's a narrative that says that the talk of inequality disregards the fact that there has been some sort of movement in society. There are societies that have been improved, there has been electrification and water provision. How should we be reading the conversation about inequality in South Africa?
You know, of course, there has been some improvement, but the improvement has been for those blacks who are well off and politically connected. Okay, so inequality,
really?
What has happened is that inequality is now also widened between blacks. So if you are nicely situated in the ANC, you're politically connected, you're nicely situated in public service, you're a BEE, person, maybe you're black and you're in the top end of the private sector, you know, inequality for you, you're now at the same level as the previously white privileged people. So what has happened is, so in the past it was just between black and white, it's now also, it's still like that, but now, you know, there is some very privileged blacks. So now we have to start talking about privileged blacks. And you're privileged if you're connected, politically, you know, your BE and so on. And that's what has happened. But I think, really for me, I mean, it's the broader issue, really. I mean, if you're a black, ordinary South African, I think the tragedy really is that, you know, many ANC leaders talk, they say all the right things, they're starting to believe themselves that that's what they're doing the right things. You know, and then the social distance between the leaders, I mean, we've seen it just there, the celebrations. When you drive your BMW that costs 2 million rands, when you have your parties
on the potholed roads.
In a potholed roads, you know, during a period where, I mean, we in a depression here, we are close to the World Bank and IMF coming to bail us out. This is serious stuff, and then it's almost like a joke.
The very institutions we walked away from at the dawn of democracy.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's almost if our own people, the people, well, family, well, you know, who in charge, who, you know, they lost their heart. They can't see what's happening here. The country is collapsing. People are starving. But, you know, there's the celebration. There really has to be, things have to be toned down now. And a little bit, you know, stop this massive celebrations because it's laughing in the face of black poverty. Be a little bit more humble. You know, accept, you know, mistakes. Bring in more people in the, you know, more people to help. Yeah. Otherwise, we really are going to be another failed state like any other African country.
Professor Zondi, as we look at the stated priorities of the year of the January 8th statement of 2020, do you also agree that the ANC believes its own PR?
The ANC has a duty as a government party, which is why we watch that development quite a lot, that event, to inspire the nation. To give them a sense of what we need to work for going forward. And what it spells out as things that must be done are actually not the ANC's things. The ANC on the stuff that must be done, it's something that is supposed to sending signals to the communities, signals to NGOs, signals to private sector and others about things that they feel as a heartbeat of the nation. Needs to be done by virtue of their electoral power. What they are unable to usually do is to follow through and ensure that everybody then rallies around that vision and try and implement it. But what they tend to do is try and turn it into a government program and hoping that they as a government can implement any of these things. Many of the visions that are spread out there would need a united movement of the entire society, as we see in countries like Rwanda, for example, in countries like Senegal in the recent past and all that, where leaders and the governing parties succeed because they are able to convince society to work together. Private sector, the fourth sector, the civil society, everybody else to pool resources together because they realize that if the country fails, they will all fail. We've not been able to build that ability to unite a country and create a social compact towards this, which is why we need us in civil society. We see failures as government, them. Actually, our failure is broader. Our failure is all of us. We failed. Even where government fails, we have not been more successful as civil society. We need to organize ourselves a little bit more because we can't fully, completely abandon our responsibility as citizens to make this country work. It's what failed many countries when everything had to be done by government. And when nothing is done, then it must be government stuff. And government has a huge responsibility by virtue of the power given to it and the resources that it has and the promises that it makes to do a lot. And we know government has not covered itself in glory, but we too have not done that much remarkably. Those are eloquent in enumerating the failures of government.
Mr. Mabi, let me give you the last word. Professor Kumeda's assertion that you are removed from the real lived experiences of the South African society.
Maybe one day when we go to our pre-Gen 8 celebrations or any other of our mass activities, we also need to invite analysts to join us. Because one of the things that the ANC has is a platform that allows it to engage with the people it leads, so that we don't believe in our own propaganda. We don't sit in meetings and conclude that things are right and not accord people an opportunity to raise their own issues. The ANC is self-reflect at all times. It is capable to self-correct.
Attendance numbers and everything, you're satisfied that the hashtag ANC 108 celebrations went well?
Well, I can tell you this now, that the people that we spoke to in the Northern Cape, directly in the regions where we visited, are far more than the people you saw at the stadium. Remember that the leaders of the ANC were spread across. I mean, the SABC has got that footage. They were spread across all the regions of the Northern Cape, and they were interacting with communities. There are many people who felt that, I heard the president speak in my community, there might not be a need for me to go to the stadium.
Okay, let's thank our guests tonight. Bulemabi is the national spokesperson of the African National Congress, and Professor Susan Boyson, a visiting professor at Wits University and also with Mistra. Professor William Gumede, the chairperson of Democracy Works. Thank you so much for coming through. And also Professor Spamandla Zondi, political science professor at the University of Pretoria. We were running a poll this evening asking you, can the ANC still live up to its promises? 15% of you say yes, and a whopping 84.5% not so convinced. Thanks for watching tonight. Join us again next week, Monday in the evening, for another conversation here on Unfiltered. Bye-bye.